Grace, are you ready to go? All right, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am thrilled and honored to have as my guest today, Grace Tame. Grace, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Guy. How are you going?
I'm doing great. So Grace Tame is an Australian activist and advocate for survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Her book is titled The Ninth Life of a Diamond Miner, a memoir. She's founder of the Grace Tame Foundation, a not-for-profit organization established to campaign for and help fund initiatives which work to prevent and respond to sexual abuse of children and others. In 2021, she was named Australian of the Year. Wow. All right, Grace, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
You are welcome.
It's quite an introduction. I feel a little bit like an imposter, to be honest.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's the shame mechanism that still sort of sort of lives on in survivors, especially of child sexual abuse, when it's imprinted in the in all of the cells, which is sort of something that you know about dealing with trauma. That trauma is something that is cellular.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
We'll get into that, but before we do, share with our listeners, Grace, where you're from originally and where you are currently.
I'm from Tasmania, which is an island state of Australia, and I'm in Sydney at the moment for the Sydney Writers Festival, touring the book, the memoir that I wrote at the ripe age of 27. I've packed a lot of years.
Yeah, I would say
into the years. I've had in some ways 9 lives. That's sort of a play on the vulnerability that a cat has at their 9th life, but it's also a nod. The title of the book is also a nod to one of the many characters in the crowd of people that I've intersected with at this point in time in my ongoing life. I am not religious in the dogmatic sense. However, I sort of tend to I'm a believer in the sort of inherent religiosity of spirituality, if you will. So I do believe that we're all kind of, like in life. My friend actually gave me a word for it yesterday. It starts with P. It's not paganism. It's another one. But anyway, I believe that we're all sort of just traveling through and intersecting with different cross sections of humanity, experientially speaking, in terms of the places that we visit as well. And when I was 19 years old, I was actually with a friend of mine who's no longer with us, Christian, who we traveled together to Portugal, and he and I had met when I was living in Santa Barbara in California, and we met this guy George, who was a literal diamond miner at one stage in his life, and he'd also lived 9 lives. And so yeah, I tend to take that philosophy with me. We're not defined by any one thing. We're not defined by any one experience, especially the negative things. I sort of was launched in Australia, was launched onto this very public platform about 2.5 years ago now. Even though I started doing the work that I do in terms of child protection, in terms of advocacy for the rights of fellow child sexual abuse survivors, about 6 years ago. I guess a lot of people in their consciousness, I was perhaps born at that point. But really, for me, the weight of the positive experiences still usurp all the negative things that have happened, or at least I try to lean into the positivity.
Yeah. Oh,
It's
I think
hard
that's
though. It can be really hard.
yeah, but I think it's a real powerful perspective to have and to hold and to nurture. But let me ask you, how did all this start? What the heck
The,
happened?
the
How did you
advocacy,
yeah,
or
yeah. How did you get to this point?
well, it's interesting because um my life has been there's not been a lot of design to it. There has been in a way. I've had some aspirations and some got intention to do certain things, and then there's also been quite a lot of spontaneity and randomness, which is really good. But it was back in 2017, March of 2017, that I was contacted by a journalist. Her name's Nina Fennell. She's an incredible journalist who specializes, or she does a lot of reporting in the area of sexual assault. She's a survivor of sexual assault herself. And she had reached out to me while I was still living in California. I was actually living in Los Angeles at that time. She had reached out to me because the perpetrator of the child sexual abuse related offences was at that point out of prison and attending the only university campus that is actually, no, there's a couple of campuses, but there's only one university in Tasmania. And my mother, who like my father, both of my parents had grown up quite poor. They're working class. They had been working class when they grew up. And my mother had never gone to university as a young woman. She, her family didn't have enough money to sit. They only were able to send the eldest of her siblings, her sisters. She's one of 9 sisters. So my mother was a mature age student at that time as well. But there were sort of lots of injustices. So this man, who was at that point a 60-year-old convicted child sex offender, was also sharing student accommodation with like 18-year-old undergraduate students, and that accommodation had shared shower facilities.
Oh, wow.
And also there were allegations made that included he would sit on the university gym equipment for hours at a time, including the exercise bikes that overlooked the early learning center, where some of the students from my high school where he had taught and perpetrated the abuse against me as a 15-year-old when he was 58, where some of those students were doing their work experience. And also that he would, sit at the in the chemistry common room where he was doing his PhD in the chemistry department, and he had a quote unquote type, and that type was blonde, petite, and blue-eyed like me. And so it wasn't that he was just there. It was that he was still continuing to make people on this campus uncomfortable. And, it was sort of later expressed, someone asked the question, well, would you have him babysit your kids? And everyone sort of resoundingly said, well, no, this is a convicted child sex offender. And also a child sex offender who was found with, a 28 multimedia files of child abuse material that included videos of adults raping children, and a folder that had a cache of photographs of other students at the high school throughout his tenure, that of topless girls, and he's quite a conniving man.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother had expressed her discomfort, and then also what happened in 2016, so the year before I had been contacted by this journalist, is that he had committed another crime. He had boasted about his offenses against me. He had described me as a demented weasel, and he had minimized his crimes and referred to himself as enviable. And then he had actually served another prison sentence. So
Oh my
he
God.
technically had 3 child sexual abuse related offenses. And it was the first case of somebody being charged in Australia with producing child exploitation material in descriptive form. And it's straight from the pedophile script, because, what pedophiles are, I mean, technically he doesn't like being called a pedophile because they say it's, they like to make distinctions that, unless it's somebody under the age of 13, and that sort of, and that's what they like to do as well, is the, buy into their semantics. But, it's straight from the child sex offender playbook, that if it's, if it's in the form of text or an image or a video or a doll or otherwise considered to be not real, it doesn't hurt anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And and this is like the continuation, and we often see this in child protection, is that behind the scenes, and we deal with this a lot because at the foundation, one of the things that we do, besides the education and the pursuit of structural reform, so legal reform, is that we philanthropically support a law firm to pay for the legal work of child sexual abuse survivors. And you'll find that these stories, like the stories, go on for decades sometimes, because there'll be the contact offending in of itself, and the grooming, for the child when they were young, and then they'll be dragged through these awful legal battles that aren't necessarily initiated by the child, or they'll just be like all this sort of behind the scenes continuation of like menacing, harassing, through all these different apparatuses. Like obviously now we have, and we didn't necessarily have this back in like the 60s and 70s, when you had a lot of clergy abuse, and all this sort of like crime rings, organized crime, because that's what pedophilia really is an organized crime in a lot of cases. But you'll see these perpetrators just not let go. Like they just cannot let go, because they're a certain like character type. And so that's what we were sort of seeing here, is this like continuation of the injustice. So in 2017, both my mother and I were contacted by this journalist. And what I was only 22 then, so I was still very young. And yet it was still 7 years after, and we'd had 2 criminal, two separate prison sentences, and he'd served 2 prison sentences. And the first instance was him. He admitted to, like, just offhand, he said, oh yeah, it was 30 times. And when he said that, what he meant by that was 30 counts of statutory rape of a minor. And I was 15 and he was 58. And it was a very dark thing that happened. It was him having taught me as a 14-year-old in a class of only 8 students in advanced maths. And I had been severely anorexic at that time. I actually took 6 weeks off during that year.
That was during the abuse?
That was in the lead up. So in 2009, I was 14 that whole year. I'm born in December, and we have a different school year to you in the States. So our school year starts at the beginning of the calendar year, and then it ends at Christmas time, just before Christmas. So I was 14 that whole year. And he, in retrospect, it was clear that he had his eye on me. And he would come up to me and he would say things like, he was notorious. So a bit of background on him. He was a soldier before he was a teacher, and he was outrageous. That was his part of his hiding in plain sight, is that he shocked everybody into a desensitized state. And it was on the principal's statement that he was using the school's resources to conduct his own Ponzi scheme. He was running his own Amway business out of the school. And and he was known for, like, one of the things he did was, at one point, he was head of maths and science. So he had to, give sometimes talks to visiting teachers or people who came to the school. And he made a speech with, like, really racist undertones, or probably overtones, knowing him. And there were complaints that were made, but then he issued a grievance. He would, like, it was that, as you probably know, the acronym DAVO, the deny, attack, and reverse, victim and offender. And that sort of flipping of the coin between entitlement on the one hand, but then as soon as you're held to account, it's the disentitlement, like, how dare you accuse me? And it's that classic gaslight. And he was very much like that. And it's not so much hypocrisy as almost just like this amnesic, like, character change, which is, like, it's funny to me. It's like the Harvey Weinstein turning up to court with the Zimmer frame. Like, have you completely forgotten who you are? Like, you're supposed to be this big bully boss boy, like, just, like, pick one. You're not fooling anyone. It's as good as, like, going to the costume shop and getting a Mr. Potato Head glasses and just, sorry, I just have to laugh. Like, it's like a trench coat. Get a trench coat, or
right.
But yeah, it's yeah, and like those are sort of the things that he did. And that year, when I look back on that year in 2009, as I was saying, there were lots of signs that, even though I had always thought that the grooming had started in early 2010, when I was 15, because it was 2010 that the physical abuse did take place. Okay. It was clear that and this is the thing. This is what is so insidious about grooming and difficult to unpack for children. And it is, I guess, and I said the Ponzi scheme before, and we see that, like Jeffrey Epstein and a lot of these offenders, the Ponzi scheme is actually quite a good metaphor for child sexual abuse, or the 3-cup Monty, because what offenders do is they take parts of your soul and parts of yourself, in those sort of blackmail rings. And blackmail is part of child sexual abuse: the blackmail, the bribery, the soliciting of images, of information. And then they sort of shift it around and hide it in all of these places that often, for child sexual abuse survivors, like, the average time it takes for a survivor to disclose is 23.9 years. Now, that's because what you're having to do is not just grow up, but to try and put all the pieces of the puzzle together. And that involves all of these different pieces or people who are part of this very complex ecosystem, like this system of fail safes, like these, and often people don't actually know that they're part of it.
All right, Grace, let me just ask you a question here. At what point did you disclose this? Did you speak out, and to
Yeah.
whom?
And well, and this makes me quite an anomaly, I suppose, given what I just said about the average time of 23.9 years that it takes for a child sexual abuse survivor to disclose. I spoke out when I was still at school, and I disclosed to another teacher of mine. So when I was in grade 11. So what happened was the abuse started in about the middle of, like, the physical abuse started in about the middle of 2010. And that, like, it continued on until the end of 2010. But the stalking, this man would drive sometimes to my workplace and sit outside in his car. He would drive to my house and he would sit outside at night in his car. He also, in year 11, when I started in year 11, knew my timetable, and sometimes I would just look over my shoulder and he would be in the doorway, or he would make an excuse to talk to whoever was teaching my class, and he would stand at the front of the room and he would be speaking to the teacher but making eye contact with me. It was very, very creepy. Like, this is a very, very creepy person. This is somebody who went up to one of my friends, Megan, who got her septum pierced once, and he actually touched her nose and said, "You're like one of the tribal women I killed." Like, this was like, he just said this stuff all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, at the end of 2008, to give you an example, this is how well known it was. At the end of 2008, so you know how, do you guys do this in the US where there's like a review, like at the end of year, like the year 12s will do a review, and they'll send up the staff and students. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so the year 12 review at the end of 2008 included a joke at his expense. So one of the year 12 actors on stage answered a mock phone that rang, and they said, "Mr. Bester," that's his name. They said, "Mr. Bester, it's for you. It's God. She says she's black." That's how widely known his racism and bigotry and sexism generally were. And everybody laughed because he was just like that. Right. He had something wrong with his wrist one time, and somebody asked him, what happened? And he said, "I fell out of bed having a threesome." He just said that stuff, to children.
This is so, beyond.
It came out later though. It sort of came out later though. Everyone was kind of just like, "Oh yeah, well, he like that. We kind of knew that." And then when I wrote my book, I started speaking out more and more, and eventually I did receive contact from other.
Who did you tell first?
Oh yeah, sorry. Sorry. Who did I tell first? I told my English teacher, Mr. Simon, who was new to the institution. See, this is a key part. So he had moved to the school, I believe about only a couple of years prior. And he told us a story, an anecdote about, a teacher who had essentially the premise of the anecdote was that, it was about putting people before principals in necessary cases, in order to save lives. and especially the lives of children. And it was about putting individuals before institutions. And I remembered that anecdote. I had that in the back of my mind. I also know, well, and Mr. Simon is gay. And so I also had in the back of my mind that this person would have experienced ostracism, discrimination, and he had no, he had no entrenched loyalty to this institution.
Mm-hmm.
And whilst I believe in, respecting, like traditions and, especially in this day and age where, I do sort of mourn the sort of like the fragmentation of like the family unit in some ways, as someone who's comes from a very big family, a very close family, despite the fact that, like we have our own, every family I think has its own troubles.
Sure.
I think there's a need to sort of respect those sorts of things, but not if it's like just for the sake of it, because that is what it enables a lot of abuse, and abusers know that. And I think that he knew that as well. I think he was really banking on that, because it's one of the things that, like, we've seen it again and in the work that we do. And so I had that in the back of my mind. And yeah, I disclosed to him in early 2011. But there was like a lot of stuff that I guess we weren't told by the school, because it's only again, we've only had to piece together all these little bits and pieces. Like we didn't know at the time that of the existence of this other folder of girls that had their tops off. We didn't know that there had been the first complaint that was made against him was in 1992, 6 months after he arrived at the school, and I was born in 1994.
Wow.
And that was like, learning these things has been incredibly distressing to hear, especially because what happens, and this is driven by perpetrators, is that you are made into, like, you are painted as the aggressor, you are made into the villain, and you constantly ask yourself that. Like, there's the part of me that goes, like, I was good at maths, right? I love numbers, and I'm like, damn, maybe if I wasn't good at maths as a 13-year-old, like, that's my crime, is like, oh, I'm good at maths.
Somehow it's your fault, or you're implicit in it somehow. Let
Yeah.
me ask you, how, as this was going on, and even in the wake of it, how did you manage? How did you cope? What's helped you as you've moved through this journey?
For me, it's just staying grounded as one possibly can. In simple values. I think simplicity is one of the most overlooked and underrated commodities, not to speak in capitalist speak, in today's world. So I really think human beings are cognitive misers, who love to overcomplicate things and overanalyze things. I mean, I'm guilty of that myself, but that's just because I'm an avid reader and I like to eat books, not literally, obviously. That would be
So as this was going on, you were just trying to stay grounded as best you could, whatever that meant for you.
I mean, look, that took a while. I mean, I did. Life was pretty tough after that. It really was. Like, I really didn't understand. I didn't know what the word grooming was until 2022. And sorry, until 2022, until 2017, when this, and that's sort of what, again, that's what started this whole journey. Was, for me, knowledge is power. Knowledge, information, and narrative are two of the most powerful tools. And they are withheld by these, by the biggest sort of, like, covert power holders, by the operators. And silence and secrecy is how these perpetrators, how these abusers operate. And for me, openness, communication, education, those things are key. Those things are paramount. And so if I find something out, I just want to share it with everyone. I don't want to keep it to myself. Also, I'm not very good at keeping things to myself. And secrecy is like the foundation of grooming, right? That operant, or yeah, the conditioning, that system of reward and punishment, which I find personally really odd, of teaching children, of like, you know, do something good and then you get a treat, or like, you know, do something bad and then you're punished. I think there's a lot of that can be really problematic, because you teach kids through that mechanism, and it is the foundation of grooming, really, of secrets, blackmail, bribery, and
I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, how the hell do you get through this? I mean, it's enough to make your head explode.
yeah.
I mean, how was there a point where you said, I need to see someone, I need to see a therapist or whomever? Who helped you? What helped you?
I mean, there have been a lot of times in my life where I have wanted to give up, and I wouldn't have been able to do it if it weren't for people like my mother, and you know, and yeah, in many ways my dad too, you know, like and my family. You know, I've got a wealth of cousins. You know, like I said before, my mum's one of 9 sisters. She's right in the middle of them. So she's got 4 older full sisters and then 4 younger half sisters. And then there's like heaps of us cousins, and running as well. So I'm a marathon runner. And that's really good. That moving meditation. I'm quite a peripatetic person, not in terms of necessarily the principles of Aristotle, but like the practice of like needing to move to think and release. There's that trauma release by moving. And I did a lot of yoga as well. And one's relationship to different releases can change over time, you know. But reading, and again, like doing things that are kind of like simple. Sometimes you just need to be able to say, excuse my English, this is shit. And that's not out of self-pity. That's just being really realistic and pragmatic, you know. And like I said, knowledge is power. And I don't mean knowledge from necessarily the institutional sort of standard. I like to do my own reading and cross-reference things, because you can find that what the mainstream wants us to know and think and feel isn't necessarily good for us. So
at what point did you get to the stage where you were like, all right, I need to start speaking out on a more broad level? I mean, I want to start helping other people.
Oh, I've always been motivated by that. I mean, I'm autistic, and I didn't even realize that autism, there's this like whole thing about autism having like autistic, it's like autistic sense of injustice. And I was like, oh, I've always been like, I don't know, I have this like human impulse. It's like this impulse to connect and help and educate. And
but on the level of child sexual survivors, sexual abuse survivors.
Well, when I learned the word grooming, I was equal parts validated and confronting. Now that there was so what I came across was this framework, if you will, or it was a list of 6 stages. Not that they happen one after the other, although they are so, you know, not very many things in life are absolute or map neatly, you know, because life's like that, you know. It's this amorphous, nebulous thing. That's nature. But this thing that I saw, this grooming explainer, which Elizabeth L.G. Glick put together with another, and I think it was Georgia M. Winters as well. These two, I think they're both American, in a paper had come up with this delineation of this process of psychological manipulation employed by perpetrators of child sexual abuse to prepare the child for the physical offending.
Mm-hmm.
And I read it, and my first thought was, why did nobody tell me about that? And with that came, well, we should tell everyone about this, because it was as if perpetrators had this knowledge and nobody else did. Because also the perpetrator who abused me, my parents had had 2 meetings with the school in early 2010 when they were aware that he had been inviting me into his office for long-winded conversations because I didn't have anything I thought to hide at that point. I would go home and say to my mum and dad, separately, albeit my parents have been separated since I was 2 years old, but I would tell them, you know, I was talking to Mr. Bester for however long today. You know, he invited me into his office, or this, you know, whatever, because I just say things. And so I wasn't concealing anything at that point. And my parents, you know, my father was a high school teacher, and he in particular thought it was very inappropriate.
Red flag.
So yeah, big red flags.
Yeah.
And so I when I read these stages of grooming, of child grooming in 2017, I felt compelled to pass this knowledge on, but not just pass this knowledge on in a dry academic way, because this is part of the problem as well, is that it's almost like there's a lot of siloing. So you'll see that academics often, they get stuck in their sort of academic language in their academic world, and they forget that like they know what they're talking about and that they know this stuff, and that then they try to translate it to everybody else, and they can't.
Right.
But it's also not connected to a real story, a real human. It's just academia, and it's just sort of goes around in circles. And I had an experience that fit directly in, or several experiences that fit directly into each one of those. And it, you know, it just illuminated so much. And I've been able to add to that and build on it. I've sort of adapted that framework constantly.
Has there been a lot of pushback here in the States in this?
I thought you were going to say, as there been a lot of pushback, and I was like, yep.
Well, here in the States, you know, when people speak out, when women speak out, women predominantly speak out, there's a lot of pushback. Have you experienced anything like that?
Yeah.
How so? What's it look like?
I'm in another criminal trial at the moment with the same perpetrator who abused me. Oh, sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but I'm laughing at the question, has there been a lot of pushback? There has been a significant amount of pushback, yes. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I've been chased home, I've like car chased home, had a thug get out of a car while I was still in it in the driveway. Both my mum and stepdad saw the car drive away. And the thug got out, bashed on the window, called me
Oh
a
my
fucking
God.
whore.
Oh my
Oh yeah.
God.
Oh yeah. I mean, we've had my fiance and I had somebody go like tip out our recycling bin, go through our recycling bin, had people in cars, stationary outside of their house, the cage rattling sort of stuff. But you
So
get used to it, and sort of, my response to that is there are far simpler, less elaborate ways to tell us that you've got a really, sad life.
so
Get a hobby like
in
knitting or something.
in 2021, you were named Australian of the Year. How did
Mm-hmm.
that come up? I mean, congratulations. Come on, that's amazing.
It's pretty, yeah, it's a
How did
very strange thing. And
but
it's
it's strange, but it's amazing. I mean, it's incredible. How did that come about for you?
yeah. So I wish I could translate that to you in a small, like in a microcosmic, oh wow. So in the middle of 2020, after I'd been living in the US for quite a while, and COVID hit in early 2020, and I returned. I was just like, I was living with my aunt. I was an unemployed advocate, I suppose. And yeah, and then in the middle of 2020, I got a phone call from the journalist, Nina Fennell, who sort of created and she runs these two campaigns. One is called #LetHerSpeak, and the other is called #LetUsSpeak. And those campaigns are law reform campaigns aimed at giving power back to child sexual abuse survivors. And mine was the test case, the first case for the Let Her Speak campaign back in 2017. And that's
Mm-hmm.
how Nina and I got to know each other. She had been the journalist, as I mentioned before, who had reached out to me. And Nina Fennell just said, "Oh, I'm thinking about nominating you for Australian of the Year." And I had no concept of what Australian of the Year really was. I really didn't know very much. I was also really quite anorexic at the time. I have dealt with anorexia, which is very much also a manifestation of autistic restrictive eating disorder. So I first experienced it back in 2009, as I mentioned before, where I'd spent 6 weeks in hospital. I had been tube fed. I weighed about 40 kilos at that time. But yeah, 2020, I was probably about 45 kilos, and I was running obsessively. I was running like 110 kilometers a week. And so I was also just a bit disconnected from everything, and it didn't really land in my head. I was preoccupied mostly with running, and but yeah, about 4-5 months later, or less than that, yeah, it would have been 4 months later, I suppose, I was named Tasmanian of the Year first. And what happens is all of the state winners, we've got 8 states and territories in Australia. All of the state winners then go to Canberra in January. And you don't know who's going to win what they call the big gong. Because there's also 4 different categories. So there's local hero, young Australian of the Year, senior Australian of the Year, and the Australian of the Year, the overall Australian of the Year. And I genuinely had no idea. I had a bit of an inkling because they make everyone write a speech. And I remember like sitting there and seeing the other recipients with their speeches ready to go, and I had my speech ready to go. And it was, you know, it was pretty nerve-wracking. And I remember like my fiance Max and I, like we were two 26-year-old kids who really had no concept of what was about to happen. We were living in a share house at the time. We had just had to get rid of our broken bed frame at the time. So we're sleeping on a mattress on the floor. Like, just sort of like, okay, you know, like Max and I had arrived and we were kind of just sort of like, you know, taking in the hubbub of everything. Everyone who was nominated and involved in the program was staying in the one hotel, and they had like a marquee set up at the front of in the lobby. And at one point Max was walking around and with no shoes on, and I was like, Max, you know, like we probably should put some shoes on, kind of thing. Like, and yeah, and it just exploded. Like our lives just went nuts after that.
Wow.
Because there's just so much
I mean, I
that
would imagine it would be obviously a shot of adrenaline for your platform, right? To help people, help
and
childhood kids.
that's the thing that's really special, is that what it did for the community of child sexual abuse survivors, in terms of a lot of their experiences have, by association, by proxy, and their cases have, you know, and like, because a lot of these institutions are now put under so much pressure, and they all look at me and they go, oh, that fuck that little girl, actually. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. You know, and that's what's really wonderful. That's what's really wonderful, is that, because, you know, whilst you can't take away from the awful horrors of a lot of these crimes, like they're dark, you know, and the extent that a lot of people don't want to admit it, you know, a lot of these news, and you guys have in America, of course, you've got some of the same, you've got News Corp, you know, like you've got Fox. These tabloid outlets do this sort of thing where they create a distance between the reader and these actual events, is to they'll say things like, oh, it was like a movie, or it was like, you know, it's like a fantasy or something. And I'm like, child sexual abuse is not. It happens every day. And what they're doing is they're trying to get you to not actually empathize, while still sucking you in for clicks. And they want to also gaslight the victims into feeling like they're insane. And what we've done is we've given so much power back as a collective to these survivors to band together, who previously also didn't necessarily know where to find each other, and then kind of collectively hold each other's hands, not just in the proverbial sense, but literally. And it's just like, you know, you can feel it. You can feel it when you go into rooms, to events, and it is kind of the stuff of revolution. And, you know, you're seeing the like, again, these big hegemonic sort of forces trying to do sneaky things, like go, oh, we're bankrupt, and, you know, we can't pay the fees, we can't pay the compensation for the survivors and this sort of stuff. And we're going, no, you know, time's up now. You really do have to face these decades, and like up to these decades and decades and decades and decades of things that we know that what you've done. And it's quite a thing to witness.
As we kind of wind down here, Grace, would you say that's your mission, in a sense, to say, you know what, no, now's the time to speak up, now's the time to listen?
Well, yeah, so on the one hand, there's the dealing with the stuff that's happened, and that's really important, but my mission is to protect children. My mission is to protect boys and girls from abuse that should never actually have to happen in the first place. And that's the ultimate purpose, right? That's what life is about, is, being here and living for each other. Children are the future. The best hope for setting a particular path in motion is to invest in children, invest in education, right?
Right.
Prevention. And it's hard to do. But if you do it right, when people say, "Oh, buy once, buy well," buy child protection measures.
So how specifically are you doing that through your foundation? How are you protecting kids?
Well, at the moment, we're in the developmental phases of some really specific education modules that are tailored for, under fives. And then also you've got and I guess first responders would fall into that response phase of things. But so early, under fives, and then after that you've got different age groups, but because there's lots of different schools of thought, obviously, and you'll see certain groups will argue against educating different demographics about certain things, and there are concerns about, quote unquote, maybe corrupting children, and that is certainly not the aim at all. You can't teach calculus to a 5-year-old, right? So the same principle applies. One wouldn't be teaching grooming to young children, but it's simple things like the concept of autonomy can translate in the early stages to things like giving, teaching young children that they don't have to, if they don't want to or don't feel comfortable, don't feel safe, they don't actually have to give an adult a hug if the adult asks. Simple things like that, and that's just one simplistic example, obviously.
Sure.
But it's things like that. It's not these disingenuous examples that might be given about teaching LGBTQI theory to children, and no one has suggested that.
Right.
And things like that, and equating grooming and such things like that. That's not what we're talking about at all. No, we're talking about tailored, specific, nuanced education for age appropriate groups, and also teaching or giving education resources to, like I said, groups like police, who only have in Australia, I don't know what the time frame is for police in the US, but in Australia, to become a police officer, you only have to do 6 months worth of training. And to think that these are the people who are not only interviewing children, disclosing child sexual abuse, but also the perpetrators, who can outsmart, often, especially if they're a lot older and they're a practiced serial offender, they're going to be able to outsmart a lot of people, especially if they're new to the force and they don't have that forensic understanding of what these people are like and how they can, they'll feign ignorance, they'll feign remorse, they'll do the sad old man act, or it might not necessarily be a man, but you know what I mean. They're practiced at psychological manipulation. It's akin to mind control, I suppose. So those sorts of training programs as well.
Wow. All right, Grace. There's obviously a lot to talk about. I'd love to have you back at a later time. I mean, to say you're inspiring is an understatement, but really I appreciate you coming on here and taking the time. But my God, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you, Grace?
They can go to the foundation website.
Okay. gracetame.com.au.
I will So there's, hang on.
Okay, that's what I have here.
Oh, so that would be my personal website.
The GraceTameFoundation.org.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll have both of those linked up here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. Love to have you back. You're doing it.
Yeah.
Seriously. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right.